So our next presenter is Adrian McGregor. Adrian is an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, landscape architect and biourbanist. He is the founder and chief design officer of McGregor Coxall, a design firm with studios in Australia and the UK dedicated to assisting cities and citizens achieve resilient prosperity. Selected as one of Sydney's 100 most creative people and recipient of the Prime Minister of Australia's Urban Design Award, he has designed new cities, lectured around the world and delivered award-winning projects across the world. Adrian's recent book, Biourbanism, Cities as Nature, is a playbook for cities to rapidly commence resilience planning based on 10 interconnected systems which together determine the health and prosperity of cities. And it's these principles he'll be expanding on today. So, would you welcome Adrian? Welcome.
Before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge the land of the Darug people in which we meet today and extend my respect to their elders, past, present and future. So look, it's tremendous to be here today, and what I'd like to do is actually frame the discussion around sort of scaling up the idea of pavements. So I want to talk about cities and the new book that I've recently completed after 15 years. So it's been an incredible journey for me to actually finish this work. But really, it does kind of encapsulate a lot of my career in terms of thinking about cities. And interestingly enough, pavements represent about 50% of our city. So if we take those pavements and then we kind of frame them in terms of the entire city, that gives us, I think, a bit of a background in which to continue today's conversations around how we actually work with, kind of shading and climate resilience, as Barry has just mentioned. So to begin, the book is a call to action, and it really is about framing this conversation around the sort of climate emergency. So can cities actually be the answer to the climate emergency? So the book begins with us, it begins with Homo sapiens, and it begins with our evolution. We have occupied this planet for a long time, and our evolution has led us into a huge amount of success. So from our roots in Africa, we have travelled east right across the planet, and we've become the most successful species on planet Earth. And what that has meant is that we now have 10,000 plus cities and a population of 8 billion people globally. So again, looking at the impact of Homo sapiens on the planet is phenomenal. And each of these cities are facing challenges today, and really this is a kind of a diagram that indicates how climate change has actually emerged, because these 10,000 plus cities emit more than 75% of greenhouse gases. So the interesting thing about cities is that the trend is that they're actually growing larger. So that top band of purple represents the growth of megacities, and then moving out to 2030, the trend is that cities are getting larger. And in fact, Sydney has now reached 5 million in population, and we are projected and forecast to reach megacity status of 10 million people in 2070. So Western Sydney is a key part of that growth, and how we tackle that growth and how we intelligently design Western Sydney is really important for our future livability. So we haven't stopped growing. So human beings now, and in fact we live today in the age of the Anthropocene, and that era or that epoch is defined by the impact that Homo sapiens have had on the planet. And we're still growing, our population is still growing. So by 2050, we're going to add 2.5 to 3 billion people, and many of those people are going to occur or be born in the equatorial range of the planet. What also is going to happen is that we're going to see a number of additional megacities. And you can see that those mega cities are right across that tropical band. So Asia, Africa are really the places, and India, where cities are still growing. Many of the other cities are mature, and growth has slowed, but that tropical equatorial zone is still in rapid growth, where we're going to add these 2.5 to 3 billion people. So with this growth, and with this growth of cities comes an incredible set of opportunities, because there are many trends that are flowing out of the growth of these cities. Aging is a really big one, 150 million extra aging people. Huge growth in GDP, but a commensurate also growth in climate risk, which I'll talk about later. 240 million more jobs, huge transitions in the way AI is affecting our workforce, and 260 million new homes needed. And we're seeing in Australia, I think this year we've had a population immigration of 400,000 people, and we're seeing daily the pressure and media attention on how we provide homes for people. So really, the premise of the book is that these 10,000 plus cities are the cause of climate change. They emit 75% of our emissions, and already today 70% of cities globally report that climate change is impacting them today. And we saw that temperature spike in Penrith here, and we know that whenever there's a heat event, those extreme events have major health impacts to populations. 55% of us live in cities, and that's growing out to sort of 70%. So cities are the problem, but therefore, if they are the problem and the cause, they must also be the solution. So just in terms of the book chapters, chapter 1, what I wanted to do is go back in time and look at the history of cities, because to learn or understand and project, forecast what our future looks like, we really need to understand our past. And going all the way back to sort of the ancient cities of the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the book traces the history of cities and ends up right at the bottom in the Anthropocene. So that's where we are today, and the Anthropocene and climate resilient cities is the next phase in the evolution of global cities. So the 10 epochs are there on the left, and then that describes how our cities have changed over time, and also the kinds of city planning strategies that have occurred. So we've seen recently, the Garden City, which is a movement against industrialisation, pollution, and disease that had emerged from city centres, and now moving into or beyond carbon cities. So clearly fossil fuels since the 1850s have fueled this incredible growth of these 10,000 plus cities. So now we're seeing energy transition, and that needs to happen more rapidly than it is. But the next move is for us to actually move into climate resilient cities. So the concept of resilience is really important, and in the book I frame it quite simply around biocapacity. So those nation states or countries that have the biocapacity to supply their populations and their citizens with the services that they need have high resilience. If they can supply fresh water, grow their own food, and produce goods that will sustain their population, then they have a high degree of resilience. Those with biocapacity debt, and you can see those countries in the red having high biocapacity debt, they're the ones that have low resilience. And we've seen that recently in terms of grain shocks and global trade supply, when all of a sudden there's an impact somewhere in the world and a lot of countries suffer very, very quickly because they're so reliant on the global supply chain. So they have low resilience. And the same concept applies to cities. So chapter 2, this is the doom and gloom, converging emergencies. So on the left there, again, the range of impacts that are sweeping cities today, many of which are climate driven. Urban heat being one of those, and of course the main topic of today's conversations. These shocks are already felt by 70% of cities reporting. And depending on what kind of city you have, whether it be a riparian city on a river, whether it be a coastal city that's going to experience sea level rise, whether it be a desert city or an inland city, all of the changes and the challenges that climate change is bringing are slightly different. So the other thing I mentioned is this global urban population, and you can see there those kind of purple colours and the yellow. So that is Africa and Asia and Latin America. Down the bottom are the sort of mature countries where population growth is relatively stable. So the challenge that we have is that these cities are developing quickly, their populations are growing, but they're probably the least prepared in terms of the skills and capabilities to be able to manage urban growth and then also be able to plan resilience. Commensurate with that has been a decline in species extinction. So as human population has grown, there's been a commensurate decline in our kindred species that we need to sustain us, to maintain this biocapacity, to ensure that we can continue to prosper as a species. And we see that today even with, for example, koala habitats in Australia. So we're struggling even to hang on to iconic species and plan accordingly to maintain biodiversity with some of these areas. So it shows that the kind of the challenges that we have even in Australia as a country to maintain high levels of biodiversity. In terms of the greenhouse gases per capita and per region, so you can see that Australia up here is very close to the US in that green. So per capita we emit pretty much the most carbon in the world. And then that purple colour there, with kind of the larger area, that's gross emissions, and that's China. So you can see that per capita China emits about half even what we do. And then you see that some of the other countries and their growing emissions profiles. So the challenge that we have is that as China and its middle class grows, then of course its per capita emissions will grow. So you can see the challenge for the world and how we manage these things. The interesting thing about cities is that they have a huge impact on the emissions profile. So in the white there, that circle is the total greenhouse gas emissions of those selected countries. And then in the centre are the three largest cities of each of those countries. You can see South Korea in the top there. So Seoul and the other two cities pretty much are 85% of the total emissions of the country. So you can see how important it is for us to deal with city emissions in order to bring down the carbon footprints of our countries. In terms of greenhouse gas by industry sector, so pretty much energy emissions, is the largest contributor to carbon emissions. And industrial energy is the largest. The second largest is transport energy and energy from buildings. So that represents the majority of emissions, and these are the places that we need to act on most rapidly in order to bring down the carbon footprints of our cities. In terms of global energy subsidies, this is the scary part, that until we can actually stop subsidies to fossil fuel industries, we're not going to reach the kinds of rapid emissions reductions that we need. And there are still trillions going into subsidies for fossil fuels. And in fact, Australia, I just read in the media a couple of days ago, more recent work done on the subsidies still going to the fossil fuel industries in Australia through diesel fuel incentives, infrastructure incentives, and all sorts of other things. So we're still putting far too much investment, public money, into subsidies for fossil fuels. That needs to shift and move into renewables really, really quickly. So in terms of these challenges, sea level rise clearly is huge. And if you look at the impact that this is going to have to people, it's enormous. So what comes with all of this, this climate emergency on cities is climate risk. And this is a snapshot from the UK, and it shows that already today there's 500,000 properties in the UK that are at risk from climate change. And by 2050, that's going to be increasing to 750,000. So in Australia, we're behind. We're still not, it's not mandatory yet to report climate risk, even to the balance sheets of our public agencies and government agencies. But I think that's coming. There has to be a time very rapidly where government agencies, as well as business, report climate risk to all of their assets so that we can understand what's at risk and we can start planning for climate resilience. I think by 2050, $158 trillion worth of assets globally at risk, which is double today's GDP. So these are phenomenal numbers. So I summarise this crisis as a designer in these words: the environmental crisis is a design crisis. And it's actually something I recall speaking to David Suzuki about sort of 25 years ago. We've designed these cities, we've designed the systems that drive them, so clearly we haven't done a great job, and that needs to change. So a quote from David Attenborough. I can't read this because it's behind me, but the incredible thing is that as an incredibly intelligent race, Homo sapiens, we have the technology, we know how to make these changes, but we're not. And when you see those fossil fuel subsidies, you see the impediments that we are creating for ourselves to go where we need to go. And that's really a crazy situation for us. And so chapter 3, and there's 4 chapters, so we're at chapter 3. So biourbanism is based on new urban science, and it puts us, Homo sapiens, in a nature-centric view of how cities are formed. So instead of at the top, we are inside this system of systems. So what is an anthrome? An anthrome is an anthropogenic biome. So when we studied ecology, many of us at university and at school, we learned about the wild biomes of the world: the deserts, the tundras, the forests, those huge planetary units that have ecosystems that drive our biodiversity and planetary systems. They sit just under the biosphere. So the premise of the book is that using recent science, we reclassify these wild biomes and recognise human impact on them, and that term is anthrome. So effectively, cities are anthromes. This map that we produced shows the impact of humans on the planet, and really so the lighter colours are places where humans haven't had impact, and we're pretty much inside most of the wild places around the world, and we've had dramatic impacts to those biomes. So this here is work from Ellis and Ramoncutty to American ecologists, which I've used as part of the model, and it shows on the top, it's broken down globally by region, but it shows the size of the cities and the impact on those wild biomes. So anthromes are pretty much like biomes. You can classify them through moisture and climate and categorise them. So as I mentioned, you have desert cities, temperate cities, savanna cities. So it's important that we recognise the climate drivers and geographies around each city in terms of understanding how we work with them. But fundamentally, what I argue is that cities are nature. They have to be nature. We are sitting inside the biosphere on Spaceship Earth, which is a term coined by Buckminster Fuller. And what Bucky Fuller was talking about was the fragility of our planet as it sits in space. So cities sit inside the biosphere. We are animals. We are part of ecosystems. We plan them. We operate them. We manage them. We build them out of natural resources. They must be nature. They are human-modified nature. And if you understand and accept that premise, it means that you must change how you design them. So the biourbanism systems are simply framed as 5 bio and 5 urban systems. So Those are citizens, food, landscape, waste and water in the biosystems, economy, energy, infrastructure, mobility and technology in the urban systems. And together, they form a lens through which you can really look at how your city is performing and how it operates, and also as a platform for decision making. So, what I then did is map the relativities between each system to show, like an ecosystem, how a city, how each of these systems are interrelated to others. So when you make a decision in infrastructure, it has a commensurate impact on water systems and waste. So they're all linked and interrelated. But we don't think of cities in this way. We silo out our thinking, and all we do is we operate in one silo. And that has to change. We need to understand that when we make decisions, they impact the entire city. What also underpins all of this, really importantly, is the circular economy, and we need to get much better about how waste is a feedstock for processes, and how we can effectively change our kind of economic fundamentals and drivers behind cities. So the last chapter, in chapter 4, so I talked about the rise and fall of cities. I talked about the challenges, the climate challenges that are impacting cities. 3 is the model for kind of nature, city is nature. And then 4 is a really basic chapter on how to build a resilience plan. So how do you, it's a 10-step process, but how can a city go about building resilience to climate? And then what I use in the book to help cities with this process is to set up indicators. So each system has a set of indicators that sits underneath it, and you can then measure and set targets against systems to basically track how your progress is being made. There are also a set of indicators that sit right through. There's 226 indicators, and these are basically open source and ready for cities to use in terms of tracking progress. The systems are integrated with the SDGs, which is really important in the global conversations around how we're working with things like extreme poverty and other global goals. So what sits underneath this now is the new kind of ability for us to map and model cities, and this is phenomenal. So only recently have we been able to build digital twins using really powerful information and data. And these digital twins then form a background for us to be able to build strategy. And of course, decarbonisation is one of those. So what we've done at McGregor Coxall is, having spent a huge amount of time thinking through the strategies and developing a model and then a set of indicators, the next thing that we've done is we've said, all right, theory is great, but it needs to be put into practice. So how can we use this thinking to actually change and help cities change rapidly? So what we did is we set up an internal research lab, and it's called the Biourbanism Lab. And what it does is it works with our landscape architecture, urban design and environment disciplines as a way of feeding information out, and also as an analytics and modelling kind of research hub. So I thought I'd just illustrate some of the projects that we've done using the biourbanism strategy. One of them is a city in China that we designed called Shenshan. And it really is a great illustration of compact city growth and then leaving the environmental systems around that, so that the green and blue infrastructure is really part and parcel of supporting the urban functions of the city. And when we designed this city, we did some testing on the sort of kind of the benefits, if you like, of what the biourbanism thinking and planning strategies had delivered in the project. And we did some high-level work with some great environmental economists, and we figured out that, I think it's, is that 3, I can't even remember now, 3.5 or 2.5 billion additional productivity over 40 years. So we did a life cycle assessment on the city, and really just looking only through one lens, and that was avoided sort of lost worker days through illness. So if you have a population in a city that is unwell and they don't go to work, then the economic impact on that city and its productivity is really, really big. So what it's kind of saying in terms of framing in the economics is that you need to look after livability in order to have a prosperous and well-functioning economic sort of output for the city. So sort of provocative idea that we've birthed out of the firm is the idea of Sydney having a mega park. So as I mentioned before, in 2070, Sydney will be 10 million people. And this idea is to effectively agglomerate and link up all the existing parks and open space that sit around Sydney to create the world's largest urban park. And that then links to the green grid inside the city. So the blue and green infrastructure is fundamental to the climate resilience of Sydney. And of course, if we're talking about shade and urban cooling, this system is fundamental to keeping the entire city cool. But what we don't do at the moment is manage it as its total set of systems. It's disparately managed, it's disparately organised. And the other provocation that I'm making is that we need to have an organisation called Sydney Parks. We have Sydney Water, so we've got the blue grid covered, but we don't have the green grid covered. So if we could have Sydney Parks and Sydney Water sitting alongside each other, organising and managing and operating this set of systems, then it's going to be very powerful for the future livability, prosperity of Sydney. So we're applying the twins at very large scale. This is a project the size of Belgium that we've been working on, and then some other provocations around kind of design proposals. This is actually a project in the Middle East where we used the circular economy strategy to drive urban cooling. So in the desert cities, 70% of energy is building related, and it's cooling. So to cool buildings, you have this huge energy footprint. So what we did is propose a concentrated solar power plant right in the middle of the urban district. And then by heating up that molten sand and then using that to kind of transfer into cooling, you then send out chilled water right through the district, and it has a more sustainable way of actually keeping the entire indoor space cool. Then, of course, externally, to keep the outdoor space cool, we use the urban forest and the other techniques that we're going to talk about today for keeping those pavements cool. So then applying some of this thinking at the city scale in the UK, our team's been working in Bristol. We worked with that city on a resilience plan. We looked at their entire public estate, and then we've basically begun to map climate impact to all of their public estate. And then that is a basis for them to then report climate risk. Canada is a long way ahead in this space, so they're already requiring climate reporting in terms of assets across the country. Australia is still behind. So just then zooming all the way into Western Sydney now and starting to use some local examples of how a digital twin in the biourbanism framework can be deployed to create benefits in our own city. This is something that the lab has worked on, where we have effectively worked with Campbelltown City, and really they've been an exemplar in terms of being a kind of pilot, if you like, for digital twin planning. And what we've done is we've built them a model. They can then use that model to import, if they want to test a DCP, they want to bring in development applications, and some of the modelling that we've done is so the lab has developed its own model and methodology for urban heat, so we can spatialise predictive forecasting of urban heat using a whole bunch of inputs that the team's developed. And of course, with that, we're looking at soil moisture, we're looking at urban canopy, we're looking at all the other impacts and effects that generate urban heat. And for Campbelltown, I think this is a really powerful tool. And it's a great, I think, example of how the rest of Western Sydney, and in fact cities around the world, can move in terms of how we can manage these systems. So, to sum up, when we scale up the pavement to realise that it constitutes road and pedestrian pavements 50% of the city, then I think now you can see and start to understand how we need to frame conversations around how we manage urban heat in cities related to climate risk. And with climate risk and extreme weather events comes direct impact to our human health and how we develop our cities into the future. And considering that Sydney, is going to double its population by 2070, there are some significant challenges about how we intelligently plan Western Sydney, retrofit the eastern city that we've already built to make it more climate resilient, and to start to actually report climate risk and be honest about it. So whether it be business or government, it goes on the balance sheet and we actually do the work. We have the people in Australia, we know how to model, we know how to forecast, we can report the risk to our assets from climate, and we can plan intelligently. We can look forward to the future, make the right decisions now, and actually be open and honest about the conversations about how we do this. If we do that, then our prosperity as a nation and the prosperity of our cities is going to be maintained. If we don't act intelligently and we pretend that this is not happening, and we don't actively and collectively work together to plan this, then these events are going to impact harder, faster and deeper. And the impact to our economies, our lives and our prosperity is going to grow. We've already seen Lismore, we've seen flood, we see fire. Australia is the canary in the coalface globally when it comes to climate change. We're already seeing it. We have climate refugees in Australia today. So the book is a call to action, and it really is a call to action to say that we all can be part of a journey of transitioning and changing our cities, and we can do it together. Thanks so much.